Welcome to this week's video. These are the videos where I try and give you an idea of what it's like to be a working musician in the UK. So coming up in this week's video, I tried to persuade the keyboard player to do a saxophone solo. I replaced half my amplifier with my Quad Cortex. And I react to this video in a justification for spending thousands of pounds on an amplifier when it suggests that I could buy a handful of components and achieve the same result. Later on in the video, I'm going to show you two clips where I'm using the Quad Cortex on two different gigs in two totally different ways. On one of them, I'm replacing the entire preamp section of the amplifier with my Quad Cortex, and the other one, I'm not using an amplifier at all. Firstly, I want to address one of the issues that I raised in my video last week. Now, I suggested that I might have a problem with my Quad Cortex. I plugged my guitar into my Quad Cortex and out of the Quad Cortex into my Vibro King amp, which is down here. And it appeared to me that lots of the tone had disappeared. The amplifier seemed to be very muffled and not reacting as it was when I didn't have the Quad Cortex in line. So my plan this week was I was going to record some tracks with and without the Quad Cortex, show you the amazing difference in sound, how much treble was being lost, and bring out some of these advanced metering bits of software and show you exactly the difference was. But when I tried to do it, I noticed by close amping the mic, this big difference that I was hearing in the room didn't transfer onto the microphone at all, and it didn't really sound any different at all. I also discovered that it didn't seem to make quite as much difference as I thought once I tried it in the cold light of day. Now, it did react differently. There was definitely treble missing, but not enough to be an issue. Although it did feel funny, it didn't sound that much different on the audio clips. So continuing on something else from last week's video, I was complaining that I was struggling to get a good tone out of a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe that I was borrowing at one of the bands that I play in. It's one of the black hot rod models, and I was really struggling with the tone. And one of the viewers of this channel, Jim Amsden, thank you very much for making the suggestion that I use the power amp in on the Deluxe and use my Quad Cortex as all the preamp and everything, which I did, and I shall show you some clips of that later. So that was my plan for this week, but then someone sent me a video by a YouTuber called Jim Leal. This is the video. In the video, he tries to establish which part of the tube amp is the most crucial to giving you the tone and why different tube amps sound different. So here's a link to the video if you want to go and watch it. You might want to watch it before you see my reaction to it. And it's a very good video. It said it took him 10 months to make, and I can see why. There's loads of research and stuff that went into it, and I learnt a hell of a lot from it. It was very interesting. But I'm now going to tell you why I'm reacting to it, because the suggestion at the end of it is that really, rather than me spending thousands of pounds on these boutique point-to-point wired amplifiers, I could have bought a handful of components from a shop, a couple of distortion pedals, and achieved the same thing by wiring up in a, well, he does it in a fishing tackle box. But so, to justify my expense on these amplifiers, and if you watch my channel regularly, you know I haven't had this amp all that long. This is my Milkman Pedal Steel Mini. Basically, I want to justify why I've bought it, so I'm going to tell you what I think of this video. So to give you a brief outline of the video, he goes through lots of different stages and components of the amplifiers and differences you get in different types of amplifiers to see how much difference it makes. So he goes through different types of biasing, he goes through the different rectifiers.
So I played some stuff into a looper, played it back through the amp on tube rectifier mode, then on solid state rectifier mode.
He looks at the preamp distortion, the power amp distortion, and the EQ stacks to see if any one of those makes the biggest difference. Another thing I didn't know about is the different order that these various stages of the amplifier go in different amplifiers, and he discussed whether that made a difference to the overall sound. And here's a diagram that he produced for that. As I say, there's loads of really interesting stuff here that I didn't know, and he's put so much time and research into this. I feel slightly bad for reacting to this video. Mind you, I haven't told you whether it's positive or negative yet, have I? Right, now to show you the box that he has constructed. He's made it out of a tackle box. I'm going to show you this clip, and as you'll see, he's basically copied the EQ circuits. He's wired them up in the order that they would be in a Fender, a Vox and a Marshall, and he's put the relevant different types of knobs on the front of the tackle box, which is pretty cool. And instead of using valves, he's just using a couple of RC boosters, and he's using just some clean line drivers just to raise the level of it. And he's wired them all up into a fishing tackle box. So here we are, have a quick look at this clip.
This is the tackle box. It was made by Shakespeare Fine Fishing Tackle in Kalamazoo, USA. I turned it into a guitar amp that I built to copy the sound of a Fender Twin Reverb, and a Vox AC30 top boost, and a Marshall JMP Aero 100 watt. So this entire amp is made out of guitar pedals and breadboards.
Now I have to say, the results of this are pretty amazing and somewhat disheartening when you're sat next to an amplifier like that, which costs a lot of money at first. So I got to think about this. Now, I'm not an amp snob. I'm often looking for different alternatives. I mean, if you've watched my other videos, you know I've been using my Quad Cortex, and any amplifier valve amp snob wouldn't want to use a modelled version. I've also looked into these transistor amps. There's one made by DV Mark, I think it is, called the Dorg amp, the Eric Gales one that Corey Wong was singing the praises of. So I've looked into these things, and I look at the audio examples and I think, no, these aren't for me. And the reason I've gone for these amps is because I've tried them, and for me they feel and sound much better than the alternative. Before I got these point-to-point wired amplifiers, I had standard printed circuit board amps. I had a 4x10 Blues DeVille, which I have to say did sound better than the 1x12 Hot Rod DeVille. So there we go, that was one thing that made a big difference to the speaker configuration. And I made a bit of a mistake when I sold someone my 4x12 Blues DeVille, because I just got my Vibro King, which was a very similar sized amplifier, even though it's got 3 rather than 4 speakers in. And I was so pleased with it, I wanted to show him what it sounded like. And when I plugged that in next to the Blues DeVille, which I always thought was a fantastic sounding amp with 4 10-inch speakers, this somehow sounded much more 3D and blew the other one away. Rather bad thing to do when you're about to sell somebody the amplifier that doesn't sound quite as good, but you learn from your mistakes. I've also played in bands with someone when I'm playing with this amplifier and they're using a £500 stock tweed Fender amp, and I never think to myself, my amplifier sounds 6 times better or similar. I always think to myself, that sounds good, why didn't I just get one of them? So I'm not an amp snob, but through experience I know that these amps, for me, they sound better, they make me enjoy playing more, they make me enjoy the sound more, so that's why I spent all the money on them. With that being said, I now need to justify why on this video it appears that he can use a tackle box full of cheap components and basically achieve the same end. So I had to think about this, and these were my conclusions. Now the first thing, and I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about trying to show you the different sound when I plugged in my Quad Cortex, is I think by close miking an amp, really you're only getting a small part of the picture. It's not like standing in a room with it. Also, you're only getting the sound of a close mic. You're not getting the feel, you're not getting the sound in the room, you're not getting the sound of the cabinet, because all you're getting is the close mic. You're getting the sound of the speaker, but not necessarily the cabinet. So that is one big factor why I think he's managed to get it to sound similar, partly because he's using the same speakers when he's A-B'ing them. Going back to that first test I showed you, where he's showing you the difference between a valve and a diode rectifier. Now I've actually got an amplifier that does that. For the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice I've had a bit of a clear out in my studio, but not a clear out, a bit of a swap around, and I normally have a 64 custom Vibroverb sat here. So that 64 custom is a copy of Steve Ray Vaughan's 1x15 Vibroverb, and it has all of the Caesar Diaz mods in that Steve Ray Vaughan had, one of them being the diode rectifier. Now Steve Ray Vaughan preferred the diode rectifier, I think from memory, a couple of different reasons. He didn't like the sag of a valve rectifier as much as the more immediacy you get from a diode rectifier. Also, I think he used to blow up valve rectifiers within 1 gig, so it became a bit of a pain, so they swapped over to diode rectifiers the whole time. So obviously with that amplifier I've listened to the difference between the 2 different modes, and clearly when I got it I put on all the Steve Ray Vaughan mods to start with, because that was the reason I got the amplifier. But I very quickly decided that I preferred the sound of the valve rectifier. I was much more used to that, all my other amps had it, and it felt more familiar. It also did something to the treble. But I know that if I were to plug that amplifier in and I were to close mic it and play you the same thing through it on each setting, through that close mic it wouldn't sound any different. But when I'm on a gig, it's worlds apart. It sounds really, really very different, and to the point where I don't like the diode rectifier. I might get used to it, but my initial thought was, no, I prefer the valve rectifier, so that's what I always used. On top of that, this, my latest amp, the Milkman Pedal Steel Mini, that has a diode rectifier, and as soon as I plugged it in I could notice the difference. It's a much faster response. It's very difficult to explain, but when you hit the guitar the note happens faster. It wasn't that difficult to explain, but that's what it is. So, but you'd have to try it to notice the difference, and I wasn't sure I liked that, because again I didn't like it on the Vibroverb, and I was a bit worried about it on this amp, although that was why I bought the amp. I thought I wanted something different because all my others are kind of Fender style. So I emailed Tim at Milkman Sound and asked him if I was able to swap it for a valve rectifier, because it did suggest there's a thing in the back there, it looks like you can pull the diode out and stick a valve in its place. And he said, yes, you can do that, but I think it sounds best with the diode rectifier and it's nice and fast, so I'd leave it there if I were you. So I thought, well, he knows what he's doing, I'm going to take his suggestion, and I carried on with it, and now I love that, and I don't think I'd ever want to go back to a valve one in that particular amplifier. I've got other amplifiers that do that, but there's something nice about it. But it's definitely a difference. So let me show you the clip of the comparisons that he's done with his tackle box. He does it with a Vox, a Fender and a Marshall. Now I have to say, the other thing here is I notice a big difference when I'm using a printed circuit board amp to a point-to-point wide amp. There's just something different about the way it reacts. A point-to-point wide amp to me sounds more three-dimensional. I remember going to a music shop and trying a Tone King amp, which I thought was a point-to-point wide amp, and when I played it, it felt different. It felt like a printed circuit board amp to me. So when I went back and researched, I found out it was a printed circuit board amp. So that makes me think that it's not all in my mind, that it is something different there. All three amps that he's using for this comparison, they're all printed circuit board amps. They're not some of the top end or older point-to-point wired ones. The Vox, he's got a Fender Twin, which is a printed circuit board one, and a newer printed circuit board Marshall. Maybe if he'd used a point-to-point amp, you might have noticed more difference. Still don't think you probably would on the close miking and the tests that he did. Well, I couldn't really hear any difference at all. I mean, this is very clever and very disheartening. And it made me think, so I went away and thought about it. Now, I've come up with an analogy here, and I think this is a reasonable analogy for what is happening. So say, for example, I put you in three different cars, say a Ferrari, a modern family car, you know, a mid-range car, and say a vintage sports car. If you were to drive along at 30 miles an hour, not talking about getting up to speed, but you're going at 30 miles an hour in all of those cars, are they going to be much different? The seats might feel a bit different. One of them might be a bit noisier. The roof might be a bit lower if you're tall. But ultimately, going along at 30 miles an hour, they're going to feel exactly the same. So when he's doing these tests and he's strumming the guitar, he's just strumming some basic stuff and getting tones on the valve amps, which, let's face it, they're not great tones anyway. I wouldn't want to gig with those tones. And then he's copying them exactly. It's kind of like driving at 30 miles an hour in a sports car or a normal car. Doesn't really make much difference. So then he turns the volume up. So let's say that's like driving along in those three cars at a steady 70 miles an hour. It's going to be the same thing. You're going a bit faster or a bit louder, but they're still going to be basically the same thing. You're not going to notice much difference. So stick with me on this analogy. The next thing I thought, what if you take those three cars onto a racetrack? Now, obviously, the Ferrari is going to be much faster than the family saloon, and the vintage sports car is going to be great fun and something in between, maybe. Now, this is probably like taking an amp on a gig or to a recording session. You're going to be accelerating, you're going to be slamming on the brakes, you're going to be backing off the volume knob, you're going to be doing all different types of things. You're not just going to be going along at 30 miles an hour. And I think that is the difference here. I know for a fact that if I take that amplifier on a gig, it's going to sound better than, well, I can show you in the clip later, a Hot Rod Deluxe. Maybe it won't sound 5-6 times better, but it definitely feels better, and it's something to do with it being in the room. It's the cabinet, it's everything. So I think I've justified it to myself. What do you think? Let me know what you think. As I say, it's a brilliant video. If you haven't watched it, go and watch it. It's very clever, and you do think to yourself, what? How's he done that? This is very disheartening. But all in all, I'm glad I bought those amps. Right, enough talk about expensive amplifiers, and on to my first gig where I didn't even bother taking an amplifier at all. Now on this gig, I'm using just my Quad Cortex. I was able to use my in-ear monitors, which I kind of think is a bit of a prerequisite for me for using just the Quad Cortex. I haven't yet tried it just using stage monitors. Now if I'm doing lots of singing, I would prefer to use my in-ear monitors because it makes life much easier. And if I've got in-ear monitors, it makes much less difference as to whether I've got a proper amp there or the Quad Cortex. It's more similar than if I was just having a full range speaker behind me with the Quad Cortex. Haven't done that yet, but I'm not sure I would like that as much. So I'm going to show you a few little clips from this gig. It was a Christmas gig, and this isn't anything to do with the guitar sound, but we were doing the Shakin' Stevens Christmas song, and there's a sax solo in it. So I said to the keyboard player, as we didn't have a sax player, do you want to cover this? And this was what he came up with, which was very funny. Now, one disadvantage with me using the Quad Cortex and there not being any sound on stage is it would make my videos of my gig clips pretty poor, because you wouldn't ever be able to hear the guitar properly. So what I did, I put the GoPro out the front while we were sound checking, so you could hear what the guitar sounded like out the front. Now, let me know what you think. I think it sounds all right, but it doesn't sound like a guitar amp to me. It doesn't sound like it's a... I've modelled my exact setup that I use, and it sounds good, and probably most people wouldn't notice any difference, and I probably don't notice that much difference in my ears, but when I listen to it, it doesn't quite sound as good to me, but it does sound pretty good. So anyway, this is what it sounds like from the front. And then, just so you can hear what it sounds like on stage, you can hear a bit of guitar. It's probably coming from the keyboard player, had a floor monitor, as did the singer, and there's probably a bit coming from the front, but this is how quiet it would be. So this is one reason why I can't use that all the time, because I wouldn't have any footage to show you on my videos. This is 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton. On to the next video. Now, as I mentioned before, one of my viewers, Jim, he suggested that I could use my Quad Cortex into the power amp in of the Hot Rod Deluxe. I mentioned last week that I was struggling to get a sound using my Quad Cortex as a pedal board going into the preamp, or the standard input on the Hot Rod, using the preamp. He suggested I might be overloading the preamp, which is a good chance. I can't really test any of this because I only turn up and plug in just before we play. So normally, and this is one of the reasons I hadn't done this, there was a little attenuator box between the preamp out and the power amp in. And although I'd already planned to use the power amp in, when I turned up, although this box has been there for years, it got crushed on the last gig and wasn't usable, so I had to get rid of it anyway. The amp still did work without it, but the master volume doesn't work on the amp. Anyway, didn't need that. Might have been handy actually, but so the power amp was running on full volume. Go into the power amp in, and I've got I think I used either a Deluxe or a Fender Super amp block on the, which I suspect has the power amp in it as well, so it's not an exact way of doing things. It wasn't an exact just preamp into that and then using the power amp. So it's not like using a full range speaker. I'm still getting all the colour from the power amp and the speaker of the Hot Rod Deluxe. So I'm going to show you this clip. This is from 2 weeks, 2 different gigs. Now in the clip where I'm wearing the white shirt, that is using the Quad Cortex as the amp. I'm bypassing the preamp section of the Hot Rod. On the other one, where I'm wearing a black t-shirt and a gilet because it was so cold, I'm going using the Quad Cortex as a pedal board, and I'm going into the normal guitar input and using the whole of the Hot Rod Deluxe as an amp. So what do you think? It still sounds fairly similar to me. There's still something about the sound I don't like, which, going back to the video, suggests that maybe the speaker cabinet makes quite a big difference to the tone, probably a bigger difference as anything. Certainly my 3 Fender style amps sound completely different if you plug them in next to each other, and the main difference with them is they've all got different speaker configurations. My Carr, which is a Fender style one, has got a 1x12, my Vibroverb is 1x15, and my Vibro King is a 3x10. Now they do all have slightly different circuits, but I think the biggest difference is probably the speaker cabinet and the speaker configurations. I certainly don't think it was any worse using the Quad Cortex. In fact, certain aspects of it were better, and probably if I get a bit more chance to fiddle around with it, I shall get there and it will be better or more versatile. I can certainly get more what I want. I could probably get clever and start using some Marshall preamps and swapping it with the Fenders for different sounds, but at the moment I'm just going to persevere and see how I get on. So here's another solo showing a slightly higher gain thing, a bit more sort of distorted rhythm, so see what you think of this sound. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Go and watch that other video that I showed you earlier. It was very interesting. I'm going to watch some more of his videos. I haven't had a chance yet, but he's done all kinds of things where he's dissected where you get the toner from a guitar, and he's just strung some strings up between two planks of wood and not having any guitar body, just a pickup. So that looks interesting. I'd be interested in his conclusion on that. Please hit like, hit subscribe. I'm bringing out new videos every week. I release them at 7 PM on Fridays UK time. Now I'm going to leave you with this. This is a clip from that same gig that I just showed you, and it's playing the solo from Don't Stop Me Now by Queen, and this is just to prove that when the singer comes over and puts his arm around me, I play lots of wrong notes and can't get it right. The singer is Lee. He's a brilliant singer and a great front man. Yeah, and he came around, put his arm around me, quite a lot taller than me as you can see, and I slightly cocked up this solo. So I'm going to leave you with that. Always end on a low. That's not right, is it? And I'll hopefully see you next week.